I got into psychology by accident. I come from a legal family. My great-grandfather was a magistrate in the Cape Colony in the 19th century. My father qualified as an advocate but practiced at the sidebar. His one sister was married to a judge. My older half-brother was a lawyer. And I was going to become a lawyer because it was in the family. Gordon, my older half-brother, recommended that I go to university, but my father having died when I was 13 after 9 years of illness, money was a problem, and I became articled to my late father's practice. I was put in an office with a typewriter and just left alone for a year, and I was not at all happy. Then our neighbour's son, who was a little bit younger than me, crowed about going to university. He was going to go and do music. He's a phenomenal musician. And I couldn't bear that. So I went to see Gordon, my half-brother, and there was a little bit of money in my father's estate which would pay for the fees. And I worked in the long vacations to earn money to support myself, and my poor mother struggled like blazes. And Gordon said to me, if you're going to be a lawyer, you've got to be fluent in English and in Afrikaans. And if a Bantu language is a good idea, and he said, and some psychology is a good idea because you can suss out people. Well, I went to university, English major, Afrikaans sub-major, psychology major, English sub-major, Afrikaans 1 year, and social anthropology sub-major. And about halfway through first year, I suddenly had this vision of myself in a white coat helping others. And so I changed from a legal orientation into the psychology major. There's also a subtext to why I did psychology. Having grown up in a pretty dysfunctional family with my father so ill and a stepfather and tremendous mutual loathing, I had a lot of personal issues to work through. Today, I think one would send a person like that for psychotherapy, or at least for counseling. There wasn't an option. I'm talking 50 years ago. And yes, it worked for me. I have worked through the issues that I had. But I did not go to university with the intention of becoming a psychologist. It just happened. My first degree was from Wits in 1960. It was a general psychology major, as I've explained. And in those days, industrial and organizational psychology was offered only by UNISA, I think. I'm not sure. There may have been another full-time university. It certainly was not offered at Wits. I was living in Krugersdorp, where I was born and raised. Traveling in and out by train and bus took 3 hours a day out of my life. Subsequently, I learned that Wits did some investigation into the variables which affected students' performance, and distance from the campus was one of the most critical. So I was losing a day a week out of my life just traveling, and my marks weren't all that marvelous. I had a very good friend, Joy Bauer. She's now Joy Welch. She lives in Stellenbosch. We were very good friends at Wits, and she got a job at the NIPR, and I applied for that. There was a vacancy. She told me I applied for a job at the NIPR. And it is, without a shadow of a doubt, the greatest thing for which I must be grateful in my life, that I got that job at the NIPR. Because everything in my life thereafter was built on those 19 years that I spent there. I've often wondered what would have happened to me if I didn't get that job. I may have become a personnel officer in a big organization, and I would certainly not have developed as I did. So getting that job at the NIPR with my pretty weak marks was the most amazing thing in my life. I started working in a division called work study, where in fact your mother worked as well. the head of work study was Lucian Cortis. I think he was a Greek from Alexandria, but he came here and he married an Afrikaans girl. He interviewed me for like 2.5 hours, and then your mother interviewed me in Afrikaans for half an hour, and I felt kind of uncomfortable about that. But yeah, I got the job. And Cortis and your mother were the initial important variables in my life. And then there was a guy called Rudolf Skavron. I reported to him for several years. Dorf spoke 3 languages, English, Afrikaans, and German, not one of them properly. But Dorf taught me about thinking, about writing, about structuring reports, skills which have stood me in enormous good stead throughout my life. Johan Skeppers, I also learnt enormously from. Johan had very high standards. I'm sure he still has them. He had vast knowledge, and occasionally what he would do, we used to have a tea break at about 10:15 in the morning. Johan would gather the youngsters around him in the staff room and hold an informal seminar session on a subject until about lunchtime. And they were amazing, quite amazing. But one didn't realize at the time just how immensely fortunate one was. This was my first ever job. I took it for granted. This was the way things happened. But of course it wasn't the way things happened. Other tremendously important people in my life were the director, Davy Forster, who was the director for the longest time that I was at the NIPR, Gordon Nelson, the late Gordon Nelson, and my professor at the University of Minnesota, Thomas Mahoney, which I will come to. Each one of those people taught me something. I joined the NIPR on the 1st of April 1961, and I was there for a total of 19 years. After 2 years in work study, where I learned how to do job analysis and write job descriptions and the fundamentals of ergonomics, this fundamentally wasn't what I wanted to do in life. I wanted more to deal intimately with people. And there was a woman at the NIPR, Dorothea Baer, who came to me one day and said, you know, there's a vacancy in the Division of Assessment and Vocational Guidance. We think you'd be good for it. So I thought about it and I applied for it, and Lucian Cortis was very angry. He said to me, you've had 2 years, a long and expensive training, and just when you're becoming useful, you now want to move on. But they allowed me to. And I went into, you've had 2 years, a long and expensive training, and just when you're becoming useful, you now want to move on. But they allowed me to. And I went into selection and VG, and I did my honours degree part-time in those first 3 years. My boss was Henry Fabian, who now lives overseas somewhere. Henry left to go to the Standard Bank. His immediate second in command was a guy called Rodney Shapiro, who left and went to America. And then there was a guy, Jan Freislich, and myself. And Jan became head of the department. He wasn't very happy, and with a month's notice, he upped and left. And Mr. Forster, the Obas as we called him, was between a rock and a hard place because he needed somebody to run the unit, and the people who were appropriate had all left. So at the age of 28, young, naive, immature, I was put in charge of a department of 12 people without any preparation, without any training. It was quite tough. I think some people were very upset about it. If I'd had some training in management, I think I would have done much better than I actually did. I think I made some pretty bad errors. And I was envious and somewhat resentful because people like Jerry Grant, who got a PhD and now lives in Calgary in Canada, and John Verster, who's had an astronomical career, they formed mentorships with people like Johan Skeepers and the guy who was head of psychometrics. I can't remember his name now. It'll come to me. They were mentored, and their professional knowledge in their field developed. I, without any preparation, without any training, had to cope with budgets and financial control and controlling other people and so forth and so on. And I think my personal development stopped at a period. I remember saying to Mr. Forster one day, we were talking, we were away in Durban on an assignment together. And I asked him, what is the impact of putting a person into a position too young? And he said, well, there are two possibilities. Either he or she doesn't handle it, and both the individual and the organization suffer, or the person handles it, but then the person suffers. And I think he felt a little bit guilty about that for a long time. I was head of the division for about 6-8 years. And I used to go into a cycle. Towards the end of the year, I used to get into a deep black depression. And then I'd go away on vacation, 4 weeks or so, and then the physical activity and all that sort of thing. Then I'd come back rejuvenated, and so on. Then I'd go through this whole process all over again. And it was a treadmill, always doing the same thing, envious of these people doing fundamental research. I'm coping with selection problems, vocational guidance problems, finance, da-da-da-da-da. And I accepted another job. So I went to go and give him 3 months' notice. And initially he thought I was having a temper tantrum. And he sort of symbolically, there, my boy, it's quite all right. And then he suddenly realized, I'm actually serious about this. I had been overseas in 1967, my first ever 3 months self-paid and all that. And then a major attraction of this job, which was in training for an international company, was that I'd be sent to Holland for 6 months to go and be clued up about what they did and so forth and so on. And Mr. Forster listened to me, and he said, if you take that job, you'll be making the biggest mistake of your life, which upset me greatly because I'd been wooed by this company for about 6 months and thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. Because, it was like leaving your security blanket. And he said to me, I think you should go back to university full time. And don't restrict your thinking to Britain or to Western Europe. He told me to go to America, and I was stunned, absolutely stunned. I went back to my office. I simply did not know what to do. Because I mentioned my marks. I didn't think that I had a snowball's hope in hell of getting into an American university. And I didn't know which one to apply to. I went back to him. I don't know what to do. So I said, look, I've got this friend at the University of Minnesota, Tom Mahoney, why don't you write to him? Which I did. Tom had been out here, and South Africa had become kind of the country of focus to some extent for him. Anyway, I wrote to him, and I made application, and I asked Simon Bishovel, whom I knew quite well by that time, to write a recommendation letter. I had to get recommendation letters. Simon wrote one and various other people. And I had to do a test called the Miller Analogies test, which was sent from the States and was administered by Professor Jack Mann at Wits. That is to that is that is to that. Now, coming from a legal background where the emphasis is on language, and emphasis on language from the time I opened my eyes, language is the thing in life at which I'm best. And this test tapped into my greatest possible strength. I did it, and Jack Mann told me afterwards, my score put me on the 98th percentile, which is very funny. So on that basis, I was actually accepted provisionally at the University of Minnesota. I had to demonstrate in the first quarter that I could meet their standard, otherwise I was out. And I did. I had a lot of guilt about not having done better at university than I knew I could do. And I went determined to prove, if only to myself, that I could be a good student. And I was. In the first quarter, I got 3 Bs. I missed getting an A by confusing job analysis and job evaluation, which I knew all about. I just answered the question incorrectly. And I lost 7 marks, and that deprived me of an A. For the rest of my time there, I did not once drop below an A. And the American system, you get a thing called a grade point average, which is the number of credits times the grade divided by the total number of credits. My GPA finally was 3.6, about which I still feel pretty good. And the research which I did for my master's dissertation, Tom Mahoney and I got a publication out of. At that stage, I'm talking 1975. Feminism was the big thing. In fact, when I wrote my dissertation, I could not use he as an all-embracing term. I either had to use plural, they, which incorporated both men and women, or structure the sentence in such a way that I did not refer to gender. So it was an extremely powerful movement. Minnesota is one of the most liberal states in the United States, and the university is one of the biggest and most prominent, I think, is one of the big 10 in the States. So the men and women's salaries was a very hot topic. Even today, women do not earn what men earn. And there are various reasons for this. They say women drop out of the labor market to have children and so forth and so on. And I was quite interested in this. And I went to Tom and I said, I'd like to do a study on such and such and so on. And it was like that big. Tom advised me not to be so universal in my thinking and tackle something much smaller. So I identified these jobs and the pay rates. And then we used students in courses that were being run. Now, I've emphasized it was very liberal university and feminism was very strong. In fact, I was walked off the sidewalk once by 3 girls walking abreast. They would not get out of the way. We gave these people the job titles and rating scales, which I had to draw up, and then asked them, just snuck in at the end, a simple, apparently innocuous little question, which was actually the humdinger. What do you think would be the appropriate pay rate for a job of this nature? And then I got that information, and then it was a long vacation. And Tom came out to South Africa, and I had to learn to use a computer, which in those days was the size of this room because they were all valve jobs, and I had to learn how to do punch card, and you get 1 comma right, and it bombs out, and But in the end, I did it, and I came back, and I had this wad of stuff with all these statistical analyses, mean, standard deviations, factor analysis, regression, da-da-da-da-da-da. And I'd labeled it and I went to him so proud. Tom, look what I've done. No, we didn't call him Tom, though, so TM. I've done this, and I've got this, and I've got that. No. And he smoked a pipe, and he says, that's great. What have you written? He just knocked the props out underneath me. But what it showed was that even in that liberal place, with that strong feminist drive, the perception of a job as a woman's job actually had a negative impact on the perceived appropriate rate of pay. I was amazed. So was Tom. We got a publication out of it. So then I came back. I was under contract to the NIPR. I had to serve 3 years. When I got to the United States, I went, okay, I've been to Britain, I've been to Turkey, I've coped with countries where I can't speak the language. America is going to be a bit of a tacky. It wasn't. It is so different from South Africa. Going to Britain is like going to a grandparents' house. America is something completely different. Initially, I hated it. And if I'd been able to come home without incurring huge financial loss and more loss of face than I could ever regain, I would have done so. It's out of the question. By the time I left, I didn't want to leave. I had adjusted. To come back here and all the drama, politics and all that sort of stuff, I wasn't very keen. But I had this 3-year contract back at the NIPR, and the folks at the CSIR knew what they were doing, because after 3 years I had readjusted and stayed. But I had changed too much. Davy Forster had had a heart attack and he'd left. Gordon Nelson was then the director. Which I knew Gordon. I knew Gordon very well. But I changed too much. The moment I went to the Wits Business School to talk about going and doing a PhD. And the guy I saw said, I'm so glad you're here. We have a vacancy coming up. We want you to apply for it. Flattery beyond imagination. So I did. And I went through interview with Jake Jacobs, who was the dean. And I had to give a test presentation, which gave me diarrhea. But I did, and I was accepted. And I worked there for 8 years, and then eventually got bored. The same thing year after year after year. And I then joined the Standard Bank. But I'd like to return to the work we did at the NIPR, because it was the most critical input in my life. It provided a foundation on which the rest of my career and my life have been built. What the work was, I've spoken about job analysis, about work analysis, job analysis, ergonomics. Then in the selection of vocational guidance unit, test administration, interviewing, report writing. I remember very distinctly writing a report for Johan Skeepers, who was then head of psychometrics. When I joined that unit, the reports were short, maybe an A4 page, which gave psychometric test results and interview impressions and so on. But to me, they seemed to be on the superficial side. And over time, I developed interviewing skills and report writing skills, which finally wound up with reports from me of 3 or 4 pages. So I evaluated a candidate for Johan Skeepers, and he got it, and he picked up the phone and phoned me in my office to congratulate me on the quality of the report that I'd written. And I did flick-flacks up and down the corridor, because Johan Skeepers, to satisfy Johan Skeepers, was a major achievement in life. That skill has been of utmost importance in my life, because I learnt to listen to what people were saying without interrupting, and then to integrate information and to articulate it in easily understood language. I learnt how to write at the NIPR clearly, simply, and practically, without any frills and furbelows. Other work we did was we did surveys of organizations. They would approach us and say, we're thinking about installing a battery of tests for this, that, or the next thing. And then a team of us, typically 3, would go and have a look at this organization. And some of the happiest times involved Ricky Mauer and a guy called Neville Osron and myself, because we complemented each other personality-wise and in terms of knowledge. And we would go to the organizations and we would look at them in terms of structure, in terms of process, in terms of hierarchical reporting, functions, job content, and and then we would devise something for them to adopt, and then we would administer, and then develop norms for them and cut-off points and all that sort of stuff. Most of it was at quite low levels, I must admit. I was also involved in something that Biesheuvel in the early days had developed, tests for the mining industry. At this point, I really must talk about Simon Biesheuvel. He was a most extraordinary man. I've heard him described as the best psychologist that this country has ever produced, which I'm quite sure is true, except that he was born in Holland and trained in Holland. En hij had met de braai gepraat. The NIPR owes its origins to the aptitude testing unit of the South African Air Force. During the Second World War, pilots were trained for the Allies here in South Africa because of our winter climate. We don't have those thermal updrafts and so on, which make, and thunderstorms, make training to be a pilot difficult. And I think I'm correct. Simon had the rank of a major, and he was head of this unit. And that connection was absolutely critical, because through it, NIPR gained access to the Otis psychometric test, which was adapted in 3 different levels at the NIPR. Simon also gained access to what the British called a WOSB, War Officer Selection Board, for evaluating officer potential, from which developed all the assessment center stuff of Bray and Byam in the United States. And Simon brought that stuff back. Smuts, who was then Prime Minister, achieved the rank of Field Marshal in the British Army, not bad for Burusian, called on Basil Schonland to establish the CSIR, because with tremendous foresight, Smuts saw that South Africa's economic development needed things like its own steel industry. And ISCOR was established. Biesheuvel went to Schonland and persuaded a very reluctant Schonland that there was a need for a psychological institute in the CSIR. He gave him 2 years and a minderwaardige status to prove that this was necessary. And Biesheuvel, the first big job they got was with the mining industry to develop something to evaluate the potential of these illiterate and semi-literate black mine workers who came from Mozambique, from Namibia, from Zambia, from Southern Rhodesia it was called, and so on. And he and his team developed something which they called the General Adaptability Battery. This was remarkable because it was you had umpteen languages that you had to cope with. So you couldn't give test results in English or Afrikaans or Zulu or whatever the case may be. They developed a silenced 16mm film to administer the tests. These things were all very robust, concrete things. That is, there were metal discs with symbols stamped on them and a tray with discs of similar kind, and then they were dumped a whole lot of them, and they had to sort them and put them into the appropriate hawkies in the tray. They had to make a cube construction, given little blocks, and they had to make cubes of increasing size. They had to assemble a metal tripod. these things were developed by Bishavel and his team, especially the late Dan de Wet, and it was administered, as I said, by silent 16mm film, and it was strict time limits, and these guys were taught all of this. A minor would come to the country on a 9-month contract, and in that time, that person had to be identified as being suitable for this or that or the next thing, and trained, go in and work, and the cost of doing that had to be recouped. So Bishavel developed this, and it was so successful that the National Bureau for Personnel Research was granted permanent status as a National Institute for Personnel Research. And the General Adaptability Battery was used way throughout Africa in the days before South Africa became the polecat of the world. The NIPR was also involved in military work, which fell away but was resuscitated in 1964. We became involved in what we used to call flyboy selection, pupil pilots. Johan Skeppers developed a whole series of tests, one of which was called tilting room, tilting chair. Immense contraption, a room which could be tilted and a chair which could be tilted to see if the boys could identify which way is up when the whole environment was being changed. Various other tests that Dan de Wet developed. I remember particularly there was a thing where they had to hold a loop and take it around quite a complicated copper tube pattern. And if they touched the tube, they got a shock. They were licked up. And fascinating, the English boys were so careful. They didn't want to be shocked. The Afrikaans boys, to hell with it, jump, whether they're going to get a shock or not. Interesting differences. So we were involved in that. I was sent out to Donata Flying School, where I lived for several months. One of the things I achieved there was to get the instructors to repeat what they called the wings test, which is the ultimate graduation test. Because Johan Skeppers was at his wit's end, because none of the predictions would come out against this wings test. There were what they called ground subjects, things like learning about navigation and airframes and engines and all that, and they had to pass tests. And there was the actual flying, practical flying stuff, which were measured in various ways. And none of these things would regress on the criterion. And I managed finally to persuade them to repeat the wings test. And they found that the two wings test results didn't correlate very highly. And Johan said, well, you know, I can't predict a criterion that isn't a criterion. I remember shortly after I'd got out to Donata, the man in charge was one Colonel Letley. And he took me up into Harvard one day. He wanted to see what this shrink was all about. And he took me up quite high, and then he said, all right, I'm going to go down now, and I'm going to turn, and then when you think I must turn to go back to the landing strip, you must say when. So we went up and we came down. My heart was here because we were going vertically down. He flattened out just above the mealies and started turning. And fortunately, through all my panic, I realized, where's the sun? Think about where the sun is and in relation to that. And so I let him turn and I said, now. And I was right. And I passed that test. And then I was able to do what I did. South Africa got its first submarines as part of the recompense for the involvement in the Second World War, Britain, once it started regaining its economic footing, gave us 3 frigates, which are bigger than the current corvettes, which the Navy has purchased at huge and unnecessary expense. And we got 3 French submarines of the Daphne class. Gordon Nelson was in charge of the military at work at that time. And we had to evaluate people in the Navy for going into the submarines. We evaluated literally everybody in the Navy. And we didn't know that the vessels were called Daphne class. We just knew these were French submarines. And Gordon gave it a code name. He called this Project Daphne. And I was interviewing one of the officers who had expressed an interest in becoming a submariner, and I referred to Daphne. And he looked at me and he said, "Where did you get that name from?" I said, "Well, that's the code name that we use in the NIPR to refer to this." He says, "These are Daphne class submarines, and that information is strictly classified." But I have to go back to Biesheuvel. And the Bushman work is a very good example. Biesheuvel's fundamental view in life was that people exist in a social structure and in economies of different kinds. On the one hand, you've got a Western economy with all the industrialization and urbanization and all the rest of it. Then you've got traditional African societies, and I'm going to say the bottom end, but that doesn't imply any value judgment. You've got people like the Bushmen that live in a desert environment on very meager food. And Biesheuvel said that whether you're in an urban environment or a desert environment, you have to cope with that environment. You have to have general adaptability. And everything that Biesheuvel did had that in mind at the back. I have heard it said that Biesheuvel was an apartheid puppet. That is absolute nonsense. He was nothing of the sort. He was an immensely liberal, open-minded man with an encyclopedic knowledge. He was, to my knowledge, the only South African ever to have been invited to write a chapter for the annual review of psychology. And that was a long time ago. Biesheuvel was so sensitive to the impact of social forces on people and their development that he actually wanted to do an experiment where he would match 2 rural African villages, same language, same structure, and the one he would use as a control group, and the other he would use as an experimental group. And in the experimental group, they would be given developmental inputs, toys, fundamental education, and that sort of thing. And then he wanted to compare the development of these people over time. He wasn't allowed to do this because it was against apartheid philosophy. Biesheuvel was a scientist who was utterly committed to honesty in science. Just when I joined the NIPR, I was actually one of the guinea pigs. It was commissioned by the company, it must have been the company in America that distributes the Wechsler Bellevue, which was the holy grail of tests, to do a South African standardization. And this was done superbly well. They got people from all ages, from all levels of education, only whites, to be included in the normalization sample. And the results showed that at every educational level, when you compared English speakers and Afrikaans speakers, the English speakers' mean scores was about half a standard deviation higher than those of the Afrikaners. Now, that was simply not allowed in South Africa at that time. When the Afrikaners had regained control over their of their country, and they were still smarting from the horrors of the Anglo-Boer War and moving into industrialization and so on. Biesheuvel published this in the South African Journal of Science, and as a consequence, he's required to leave the NIPR. So, investigations that sort of were aimed at demonstrating that the differences between people were not fundamentally genetic was simply not available, not on. As an aside, when I went to Wits, genetics in human behavior was sort of nodded at. Yes, it provides the basic potential, but really what is important is the environment, and this and that and that. And the quotations by Americans, if you give me a child before that child is a year old, I will turn that child into anything you want, which of course these days is a lot of nonsense. I've been fascinated to see how the pendulum has swung from this tremendous behavioristic learning influence of 50 years ago to a situation where now it's genetics über alles, which I think is a mistake. Genetics is not über alles. There is a lot of learning, a lot of social interaction that has to happen. I would say do not be misled by the current phase for viewing genetics as the fundamental foundation for all behavior, even including, say, sexual orientation. It is not true. We grow up in a family, and we learn from our parents, and we grow up in schools, and we learn from our peers, and etc., and all the way through life until your late teens, early 20s, when you start consolidating all of this. I think that when I was at university, genetics was underplayed, without a doubt. I think that through the amazing developments of DNA testing and of MRI and non-invasive examination of the brain, better than what was done at the NIPR with its electroencephalographs and things like that. Nowadays, people can actually look inside the brain when people are doing particular tasks, and various parts of the brain kind of light up. We know now that genetics is terribly, terribly important. I worked for a time at the Standard Bank with Dr. Retief, who was very into the work of Elliot Jakes, about which I must talk, and thinking, intelligence. Alexis was of the opinion that intelligence is fundamentally the density of neural interconnections in the prefrontal cortex. If you've got 2 points, A and B, there are 2 options of interaction, A to B, B to A. If you've got 3 points, you get you got A to B, B to C, and then so it goes from 2 to 6, and you get this exponential development. Now, if you have more neural interconnections in your prefrontal cortex, which is where thinking happens, your capacity to handle information expands. Back to the NIPR, must have been in the late 1960s. Jerry Grant and Johannes Kreppers wrote a paper which they published in the journal of the NIPR, the Psychologia Africana, which I still have bound in half leather, on information processing as the foundation of intelligence. Now, this predates the current emphasis in psychological thinking of the work of Elliot Jakes. And thinking back, that is quite amazing that at that time, Skeppers was so far advanced in his thinking and his knowledge and influenced by Bissell that they could actually conceive of intelligence as an information processing activity, because fundamentally that's what it is. Elliot Jakes, he was a French Canadian, and he didn't have a C in his surname, and he wasn't Jacques, he was Elliot Jakes. He did some work at the end of the Second World War. He examined pay scales, curves of people, and he realized that behind the pay curve there's actually a career development. And behind the career development there's an individual with certain skills and propensities and competences and so forth and so on. And he developed a model which was adapted by Bissell and Cortis for job analysis and job evaluation, which is fundamentally an information processing complexity. Jakes distinguished between labor, which doesn't involve decisions, and work, which does involve decisions. If you're a laborer, you do exactly what your boss tells you to do. Sweep here. If, however, you're a sweeper in a factory, and it is your job to keep the floor clean, you can make the decision whether to sweep there or not to sweep, depending upon whether there's rubbish on the floor. That is a decision. You've got decision options, and you project the consequences. If you don't sweep, you're supposed to sweep, sooner or later your boss is going to come down on you. Then at the other end of the scale, you have got the President of the United States, who, when he or she makes a decision, has got to think about the country, about international relations, about the global warming, about oil, da-da-da-da-da. The amount of information which that person has to take into account is hugely more. A lot of it is unavailable. It's got to be guessed at or deduced. The thinking process is very, very much more complex. Jakes went to a university in England and founded the Brunel Institute of Social Studies. It's called in South Africa BIOS. And this fundamental concept of Jakes has been developed into methods of assessing people using interviews only, and also of looking at, of doing job analysis. And I used to be an associate of BIOS, and I see some of the people from time to time. A guy called Jacques said, "You know what we're doing? We're doing this, we're developing this thing to look at job." I said, "Forget it. We did it at the NIPR 40 years ago." I've still got my manual, which in some ways is actually better than what they're doing.
Take it for me now to, have you seen patterns in psychology over the years? You've said a little bit of that about the genetics, and then I'd like for us to kind of to wrap it up, because I think in terms of timing possibly
we've got 9 minutes left.
Okay.
So in terms of timing, just your, maybe you've said it, but if there's something you would like to say, is there anything you regret? Is there anything that you feel that young psychologists should know?
Also just if you had another 100 years question,
What
I
would
like
you do? Yes, that's
Okay.
a nice one.
The question which you've posed for me is actually very difficult. For the reason that I've been retired for 11 years, I have not kept up with the literature. I don't know. The major theoretical swing that I've seen has been from the tremendous emphasis on learning through to a recognition of the impact of genetics and physiology. If I were to advise a young person going into that, I would say the following. Be aware of the profound impact of genetics and physiology, but Do not blind yourself. Social influences and learning are very, very important. The second thing I would say to a youngster going into that field is don't over-specialize. Don't go only into industrial psych and ignore the clinical aspect. Don't go only into counseling and ignore the industrial stuff. I think universities actually are making an error by specializing into those domains too early. Sometime colleague of mine, Dr. Derek Shirley, we worked together at the Standard Bank. He says there's only one psychology in life. And I think Ricky Mauer is a very, very good example. Ricky has got a PhD in industrial psych. Then he went and did a clinical M and did his internship and practiced for a while and so forth and so on. And I saw him a couple of weeks ago. We've been friends since 1965. And I said to him, if you had it all over again, what would you change? He said, I do not do clinical work anymore. I don't want to do clinical work. But I'm very, very glad that I did the degree and got the experience because it has opened another perspective in my life and my work. So my advice to youngsters is get as broad an exposure as you possibly can. Another thing I would say to a youngster is don't stick too long in one organization. I stayed in the NIPR for too long, 19 years. I should have moved sooner, I think, not sure. Every organization you go to, you learn different things. When I went to the business school, I learned a whole basket of new stuff. When I went to the Standard Bank, I'd gone from 2 academic environments into a business environment. It was like being dumped into an ice-cold swimming pool because it was so different. But I did okay, and we did phenomenal work at the Standard Bank. Really, really, we did phenomenal work at the Standard Bank. Apart from that, I don't really think so. And if I did 100 years, do it all over again? I don't really know. I think I would have made a good lawyer because I'm a very logical thinker, both deductively and inductively. My strength in life is language, not numbers. I had personal problems to deal with. Studying psychology helped me overcome those. I'm not sorry at all that I did what I did. And I think I've done reasonably well. Materially, I've done reasonably well. I've got a very nice house. I've got a nice car. I've traveled overseas many times. Retired 11 years. I'm not wealthy, but I'm comfortable. And that's all come out of what I did. Another thing that I would say to youngsters entering the field is that they should critically examine the Americo-Anglo, and I say Americo-Anglo, not Anglo-American, because predominantly it has come out of America and has been adopted by Britain. The models of cognition and personality, whether they are in fact applicable, for example, to our local black population, whether they're applicable, say, to Indians. I think there are certain things that must be applicable. For example, the work that Alexis Retief's view on the foundation of intelligence, your population group would be completely irrelevant to that. But I think in the domain of personality, there may very well be, I will use the term, racially influenced structures and patterns that come out. For example, currently there's the Big Five. Now, do you find the Big Five amongst blacks, amongst Indians, amongst Chinese? I don't know. But I think that would be a very, very worthwhile field for youngsters to enter into and study. And I think that the fact that today we do not have an NIPR or its equivalent that could address those sort of questions is an utter tragedy, because this country needs it, the world needs it, and good luck to them.